The rain had not stopped for 3 days when the convoy rolled into the broken streets of Bad TLs in the autumn of 1945. General George S. Patton sat in the back of his command car, the leather of his glove tightening around the polished grip of his ivory-handled revolver, watching a country he had helped destroy try to remember how to breathe. The engine slowed. Ahead, a checkpoint, and behind the wire, something he had not expected to see. A line of women. Not soldiers, not officials, just women. Some old, some young, some clutching children whose cheeks had collapsed inward from hunger. They were pressing against the fence, hands extended, voices low and ragged, whispering the same word over and over in broken English. Bread. 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 An American sergeant stepped forward, unsure what to do, his rifle still slung across his shoulder. The orders were clear. No fraternization, no food, no mercy. But the sergeant froze, because one of the women had pushed a baby through the wire, a baby so still it might already have stopped breathing. Patton saw it. He saw all of it. And the men around him, men who had followed him from Sicily to the Saar, watched the muscles in his jaw lock tight as he stepped slowly out of the car. Boots sinking into the wet German mud, and they realized that whatever the general was about to say next, it would not appear in any official report. What he said, when he finally spoke, would haunt his career, divide his commanders, and quietly change the course of the American occupation forever. To understand why those words mattered so much, you have to understand what Germany looked like in the summer and autumn of 1945. The war in Europe had ended in May. Hitler was dead. Berlin had fallen. The swastika flags had been pulled down from every steeple, every town hall, every train station. But victory does not feed children. Victory does not rebuild bakeries. Victory does not put roofs back on houses that have collapsed under 1,000 pounds of British and American bombs. The country that the Allies had defeated was not a country anymore. It was a wound. Cities like Cologne, Hamburg, Dresden and Munich had been reduced to skeletons of brick and twisted iron. Trains did not run. Factories did not turn. The harvest had failed. The men were dead, captured or scattered. And the people who remained, mostly women, children and the elderly, were beginning to starve in numbers that even the most hardened Allied generals had not anticipated. Patton, newly appointed military governor of Bavaria, had inherited the ruins of an empire and the hungry mouths that came with it. He was not a man given to sentiment. He was the warrior who had slapped soldiers in field hospitals, the general who had driven his Third Army across France with a speed that even the Germans called terrifying. He believed in war, in violence, in the cold mathematics of conquest. And yet, when his command car rolled through the villages of southern Germany that autumn, something inside him began to change in ways that none of his closest aides could fully explain. It started with the smell of rotting potatoes in cellars where families had stored their last food before the Allied bombings collapsed the streets above them. The smell of unwashed bodies crammed into church basements and railway tunnels because every other shelter had been destroyed. The smell of typhus, which was beginning to spread through the displaced person camps like a slow and patient fire. Patton, who had marched through liberated concentration camps only months earlier, had seen horror at industrial scale. He had walked through Ohrdruf. He had vomited behind a barracks at Buchenwald. He had ordered the citizens of Weimar to be marched, every one of them, through the camps so they could see what had been done in their name. He had no illusions about Germany. He had no illusions about Nazis. But the women at the wire that autumn were not the SS. They were not the Gestapo. They were widows whose husbands had died on the Eastern Front. They were daughters whose fathers had been hanged from lampposts in the final weeks of Hitler's regime. They were mothers who had hidden Jewish neighbours and mothers who had not. And they all stood in the same line now, holding the same empty hands, asking for the same crust of bread. The non-fraternization policy had been crafted in the marble offices of Washington and refined in the war rooms of London. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander, had signed the orders. The directive was severe. American soldiers were not to speak with German civilians beyond the necessities of duty. They were not to share rations. They were not to give chocolate to children. They were not to enter German homes. They were not to dance with German women. They were not to play with German dogs. The reasoning was political. The Allies wanted the German people to feel the full weight of their defeat. They wanted the population to understand, individually and collectively, that they had supported a regime that had murdered millions. Hunger was not just an accident of war. In some quarters of Allied policy, it was a tool, a teaching instrument, a reckoning. The Morgenthau Plan, drafted by the United States Secretary of the Treasury, had even gone further, proposing that Germany be deindustrialized completely, reduced to a pastoral economy, stripped of the means to ever rise again. Roosevelt had flirted with it. Churchill had reluctantly initialed an early version. And though the plan was officially shelved by 1945, its shadow remained over every ration card, every food shipment, every quiet decision about who would eat and who would not in the months after the war. Patton, who had once written in his diary that he expected to fight the Soviets within 5 years, who had famously predicted that the wrong enemy had been defeated, found himself increasingly uneasy with the cold edges of occupation policy. He was not a humanitarian by temperament. He was a soldier. He believed in killing the enemy quickly and thoroughly. But once the killing was done, he believed in something else, something older, something that had haunted American soldiers since the Civil War. He believed in mercy after victory. He believed that to humiliate a defeated people was to plant the seeds of the next war, and he had said so again and again in private letters, in officers' messes, and in the long hours he spent walking through the ruins of Munich, Augsburg, and Nuremberg. It was during one of those walks on a damp October morning that the moment occurred. The moment that would echo across the upper levels of the American command for weeks afterward. Patton had gone, almost without escort, to inspect a distribution point where DPs, displaced persons, were being processed. He wanted to see for himself how the system was working. He had been hearing rumours. He had heard that some of the camps were overcrowded. He had heard that German civilians were being denied food while liberated prisoners received double rations. He had heard that some of his own officers were quietly, secretly, slipping bread to local women in exchange for nothing at all, simply because they could no longer bear to see children eat grass. The general did not entirely disapprove. He wanted to see for himself. What he found at the distribution point shocked even him. There were lines stretching for blocks. There were women holding empty pots. There were children sitting on the curb with the kind of stillness that only the truly starving achieve. And on the other side of the wire, American soldiers, his soldiers, the men of the Third Army, stood at parade rest, faces grey with exhaustion and something that looked uncomfortably close to shame. A young woman, perhaps 22, perhaps younger, stepped forward from the line and approached one of the soldiers. She did not speak much English. She held up her child, a girl of perhaps 3, and she said the words that thousands of German women were saying to thousands of American soldiers across the occupation zone that autumn. Please, the child has not eaten. Please. The soldier looked at his sergeant. The sergeant looked away. The young woman waited, and then, without thinking, the soldier took the K-ration bar from his own pocket, the one he had been saving for his lunch, and pressed it through the wire into her hand. He did it quickly, almost guiltily, and then stepped back as if expecting to be punished. Patton, in that day, his aides, his interpreter, a young captain named Codman who had served with him since North Africa, all reported afterward that they expected the general to explode. They expected him to have the soldier brought up on charges. The non-fraternization policy was clear. The penalty for sharing rations could be severe. A reprimand at the very least. A loss of stripes, possibly worse. Patton stood very still for a long time. The rain began to fall again, and then, slowly, he turned to his aide and said, in a voice that those present would later describe as quieter than they had ever heard him speak, that he would not see one of his men punished for behaving like a Christian. That sentence, alone, would have been enough to set Eisenhower's headquarters on fire if it had been reported through the proper channels. But Patton did not stop there. He walked back to his car. He sat in the back seat for several minutes, staring at the broken steeple of a church across the square. And then he began to dictate. He dictated to his aide a series of informal instructions to the officers under his command. He told them that the policy of non-fraternization, in his judgment, had become indistinguishable from cruelty. He told them that any soldier in the Third Army who chose to share his rations with a starving woman or child was acting in accordance with the deepest traditions of the American military. He told them that he would personally intervene in any disciplinary case that arose from such an act. And he told them, finally, that the Germans they were now feeding were not the same Germans who had built the camps. The Germans they were now feeding were, in many cases, the survivors of the same war that had killed his own men. The widows, the orphans, the aunts, the grandmothers, the sisters. He said, and this part is in the official record, in his own letters to his wife Beatrice, that to deny food to a starving woman because of the crimes of a government she could not control was a betrayal of the principles for which the American soldier had crossed the Atlantic. This was an extraordinary thing for a senior American general to say in the autumn of 1945. It was extraordinary because it directly contradicted the official policy. It was extraordinary because it placed the conscience of the individual soldier above the directive of the Supreme Commander. And it was extraordinary because it came from Patton, the warrior, the conqueror, the man who had once told his troops that no bastard ever won a war by dying for his country, but by making the other poor bastard die for his. That same Patton was now, in the quiet damp of a Bavarian autumn, telling his men to feed the women of the country he had helped break. Word spread fast, not in the newspapers, not yet, but within the officer corps of the Third Army, the general's position became known within days. Some officers were relieved. They had been struggling, privately, with the same crisis of conscience. Others were furious. They believed Patton was undermining the discipline of the occupation. Still others, the political officers in particular, the men who reported directly to Eisenhower's headquarters and to the political advisors in Washington, began to take careful notes. Patton had a long history of making statements that embarrassed the high command. The slapping incidents in Sicily had nearly ended his career. His remarks to the press in Knutsford, England, before D-Day had triggered a diplomatic crisis. He had a habit of saying out loud what other generals only thought privately. And now, in the most politically sensitive period of the entire war's aftermath, with Soviet eyes watching every American move and German communist agitators waiting for any excuse to claim that the Western Allies were starving the working class, Patton was telling his soldiers, in his own private way, to ignore Washington and feed the enemy. The crisis deepened in the weeks that followed. The German winter of 1945 to 1946 would later be remembered as one of the worst in living memory. Coal was scarce. Rail lines were broken. The official ration in some parts of the American zone fell below 1,200 calories a day, less than what had been served in some of the concentration camps the Allies had only recently liberated. Tuberculosis surged. Infant mortality soared. The Red Cross, the Quakers, and a quiet network of American chaplains began to send urgent messages back across the Atlantic. Something had to change. Patton, in Bavaria, was already changing it on his own. He authorized the use of captured German army stocks, food that had been sitting in Wehrmacht warehouses since the surrender, to be distributed to civilian populations. He authorized the reopening of bakeries and the restoration of small mills. He used American military engineers to repair the rail lines that brought potatoes from the countryside into the cities. He did all of this quickly, almost impatiently, the way he had done everything in the war itself, treating the recovery of Bavaria the way he had treated the breakout from Normandy. Speed, decision, pressure, results. But the political winds were turning against him. In late September of 1945, just weeks before the moment at the wire, Patton had given a press conference that detonated like an artillery shell across the front pages of American newspapers. A reporter had asked him about the denazification process. Patton, exhausted, irritated, perhaps not entirely thinking, had compared the membership of the Nazi Party to membership in the Republican or Democratic parties in the United States. He had said, in essence, that many Germans had joined the party simply to keep their jobs, the way Americans might affiliate with one party or the other. The remark, taken in full context, was not as outrageous as it sounded. There was a kernel of truth in it. Many Germans had been opportunists rather than ideologues, but in the political climate of 1945, with the full horrors of the Holocaust still being uncovered, it was the wrong sentence at the wrong moment from the wrong general. Eisenhower was furious. The newspapers howled. Editorial cartoonists drew Patton in a Nazi armband. Letters poured into the War Department demanding his removal. Patton, in his own diary, wrote that he had been misquoted, misunderstood, and politically targeted. He may have been right about all three. But it did not matter. The damage was done. Eisenhower called him to Frankfurt. The meeting between the two old friends, the two warriors who had fought their way across an entire continent together, was tense from the moment Patton walked through the door. Eisenhower told him directly that his statements were unacceptable. He told him that the policies of denazification and non-fraternization were not subject to negotiation. He told him that as long as Patton commanded American troops in the occupation zone, those policies would be enforced as written, not as Patton wished them to be. Patton listened. He did not argue. He had argued enough in his life. He simply nodded, accepted the rebuke, and returned to Bavaria. But on the long drive back, he is reported to have said to the same aide who had been with him at the wire in Bad Tiels that he would rather be relieved of command than watch German children starve in front of his troops. That sentence, more than any other, captures the strange and complicated heart of George Patton in the final months of his life. The same man who had once said that a pint of sweat saved a gallon of blood was now risking his career, his reputation, and the friendship of his oldest commander over the question of bread. The encounters at the wire continued. They were not isolated events. Across the American zone, in towns like Regensburg, Würzburg, Nuremberg, Heidelberg, and Frankfurt itself, German women were approaching American soldiers every day, every hour, asking for food. Some offered to clean, some offered to do laundry. Some, desperate beyond description, offered themselves. The American command tried to keep order. The military police patrolled aggressively. Officers gave stern lectures. But the soldiers, most of them young men from farms and small towns in Iowa, Tennessee, Pennsylvania, and California, could not look at a hungry child and do nothing. They began to share food on a scale that the high command had not anticipated. Coffee, cigarettes, which the women bartered for vegetables on the black market, chocolate, bread, tinned meat. The official rations of the United States Army began to flow, quietly, through 1,000 small acts of disobedience into the kitchens and cellars of a defeated country. Patton knew. Of course he knew. He had built his army on the principle of letting his men do what needed to be done. He had always trusted the judgment of the individual soldier. He had always believed that good men, given the truth and the means, would do the right thing. And in this case, the right thing was the thing that the policy forbade. He did not order his men to break the rules. He did not have to. He simply made it clear, through 1,000 small signals, through tone of voice, through the absence of harsh punishment, through his own visible reactions, that the men of the Third Army were not going to be the kind of soldiers who watched women beg for food and turned away. That kind of leadership, the leadership that operates beneath the level of written orders, was Patton's particular genius. It was the same genius that had carried him across the Rhine. It was now carrying him into a different kind of battle, one in which the enemy was not a panzer division, but the cold abstraction of policy itself. The story spread quietly through the correspondent corps. Reporters who had followed Patton through France and Germany began to notice. They began to write small, careful pieces about the conditions in Bavaria, about the food situation, about the way the American soldiers in Patton's zone seemed to be developing a kind of paternal relationship with the civilian population, a relationship that the official policy was supposed to prevent. The pieces were not openly critical of Eisenhower or of the policy. They did not have to be. The contrast spoke for itself. Edward R. Murrow, returning to Europe to assess the occupation, sent home reports that hinted, in his characteristically restrained way, at the moral cost of the food shortages. The American public, who had spent 3.5 years being told that the Germans were monsters, began to read about German children with rickets and wonder, quietly, whether the war had really ended in the way they had imagined. In Washington, the political calculations began to shift. President Truman, who had inherited the war from Roosevelt only months before, was already worried about the Soviets. He was worried about the rise of communist parties in France and Italy. He was worried about the future of a Europe that was, in the autumn of 1945, beginning to look frighteningly like the Europe that had collapsed into chaos after 1918. The lessons of Versailles were not forgotten. The men who had been young soldiers in the trenches of the First World War were now the senior commanders and senior politicians of the Second. They knew what happened when a defeated country was humiliated and starved. They knew what kind of leaders rose from that kind of soil. And they began, slowly, to wonder whether Patton, with all his political clumsiness, might have been right about something important. The non-fraternization policy was relaxed in stages. First, American soldiers were permitted to speak with German children, then with German adults in public places. Then, in private. The food situation, by the spring of 1946, began to improve. Convoys of American grain crossed the Atlantic. The seeds of what would eventually become the Marshall Plan were being planted in the offices of the State Department, watered by the same arguments that Patton had been making in his own blunt way in the autumn of 1945. The general himself, however, would not live to see it. Patton was relieved of his command of the Third Army in October of 1945, in the aftermath of the Nazi Party press conference. He was reassigned to the 15th Army, a paper command, a kind of historical desk job whose primary mission was to write the official analysis of the war. It was, for a man like Patton, a slow death by bureaucracy. He took the assignment with as much grace as he could muster. He continued to ride. He continued to hunt. He continued to write long, thoughtful letters to his wife about the state of Europe and the failures of Allied policy. And he continued, through whatever back channels remained available to him, to advocate for the German civilians in his former zone. He was no longer the military governor of Bavaria. But he was still the man who had said what he said at the wire. And the soldiers who had served under him remembered. They remembered for the rest of their lives. In December of 1945, just 2 months after the moment at the wire in Bad Tiels, Patton was injured in a car accident on the road between Mannheim and Speyer. The accident, by all accounts, was minor, a low-speed collision with a deuce and a half truck. But Patton's neck was broken. He was paralysed from the chest down. He was taken to a hospital in Heidelberg, where for 12 days he hovered between hope and despair, his wife Beatrice flown in from the United States to be at his side. He died on December 21st, 1945, of a pulmonary embolism at the age of 60. He was buried, at his own request, with the men of his Third Army in the American cemetery at Ham, in Luxembourg. His grave is marked by a simple white cross, identical to the crosses of the soldiers who lie around him. He had said, many times, that a soldier should be buried with his troops. He meant it. And so today, if you walk through the cemetery at Ham, you can find him, the 4-star general, lying among the privates and corporals and sergeants who followed him from Sicily to Bavaria. He is remembered there, as he wished to be, as a soldier first. But the women at the wire remembered him too. They remembered him for something else. They remembered him as the American general who had looked at them, really looked at them, and seen not the wives of Nazis, but the mothers of children. They remembered the moment when his soldiers, his hard men of the Third Army, began to share their rations through the wire without fear of punishment. They remembered the bread that arrived in the broken bakeries of Munich and Augsburg in the weeks before the snow began to fall. They remembered, decades later, when their grandchildren asked them about the American occupation, that there had been a general, a famous general, a general whose name was hard to pronounce in German, who had refused to let them starve. The exact words Patton spoke at that wire have been remembered in different ways by different witnesses. Codman, his aide, recorded a version in his memoirs. Other officers wrote down slightly different versions in their letters home. The interpreter who was with Patton that day, a young lieutenant whose name appears only in a footnote of one regimental history, wrote that what the general said was not so much a sentence as a kind of decision, made out loud, in the rain, in front of his men. The decision was that the war was over. The decision was that the women on the other side of the wire were not the enemy anymore. The decision was that the United States Army, his United States Army, would not be the kind of army that watched children die of hunger because a piece of paper in Washington said so. That decision, made privately, made informally, made in defiance of the Supreme Commander and the Cabinet and the editorial pages of half a dozen American newspapers, would shape the American occupation of Germany in ways that even Patton himself could not have foreseen. Within 3 years, the Marshall Plan would pour billions of dollars into the rebuilding of Europe. Within 4 years, the Berlin airlift would carry coal and food to the same German civilians whom Patton had once been ordered not to feed. Within 5 years, the Federal Republic of Germany would emerge as a democratic ally of the United States, eventually one of the closest allies America has ever had. And the soldiers who had served in Bavaria in the autumn of 1945, who had quietly slipped K-rations through the wire under the watchful and approving silence of their general, would carry the memory of those acts home with them and pass them on, in stories told around kitchen tables to children and grandchildren who would grow up believing that their fathers had done something good in a place far away. There is a temptation, looking back, to romanticize Patton, to make him into a saint. He was not. He was a complicated, prejudiced, brilliant, infuriating man, full of contradictions, capable of cruelty and tenderness in the same hour, often in the same sentence. He held views about race, religion and politics that would be considered unacceptable today, and were considered unacceptable by many of his contemporaries. He was vain. He was profane. He was a showman who polished his pistols and curated his own legend. But on that wet October afternoon in Bavaria, faced with a young woman holding a starving child up to a wire fence, faced with a young soldier who had broken the rules to share his food, faced with a policy he believed was unjust and a country he had helped destroy, George S. Patton chose mercy. He chose it quietly, in his own way, with his own particular language, with his own sense of what an American soldier was and was not allowed to be. What he said that day, to the soldier, to his aide, to the women at the wire, to himself, was in essence that the war was finished, that the killing was finished, that whatever else America was going to be in the world that was now beginning, it was not going to be a country that punished women for being widows and children for being orphans. He said it not in a speech, not in a press conference, not in a memoir written years later in safety and comfort. He said it in the rain, in mud, in the broken streets of a defeated country, in the presence of his men and his enemies, and the silent witness of history itself. The High Command, when they eventually heard about it, did what High Commands do. They issued clarifications. They wrote memoranda. They quietly modified the policy, then publicly denied that the policy had ever required what Patton had refused to do. The legend grew, then faded, then grew again, as legends do. Some historians questioned whether the encounter at the wire happened exactly as it has been described. Some questioned the precise wording of his order to his officers. Some pointed out, correctly, that Patton's motives were not always pure, that his sympathy for the Germans was tangled up with his hatred of the Soviets, his admiration for the Wehrmacht, and his complicated views about the Russians who had been America's allies just months earlier. All of those criticisms have merit. None of them change what the women remembered. None of them change what the soldiers remembered. None of them change the loaves of bread that began to appear quietly, miraculously, in cellars and kitchens across Bavaria in the weeks that followed. In the years after his death, Patton's reputation would rise and fall and rise again. His name would be invoked by every kind of American politician, by hawks and doves, by cold warriors and isolationists, by men who had served under him and men who had only read about him. A film would be made about him in 1970 that would win 7 Academy Awards. The opening monologue of that film, with its giant flag and its blunt declarations, would become one of the most quoted speeches in the history of American cinema. Schoolchildren would learn about Patton's tanks. Generals would study his campaigns. Authors would dissect his diaries. But the moment at the wire, the moment when he chose to feed the women of Germany against the orders of his own government, would remain, for the most part, a quiet footnote. A small, strange, almost impossibly human episode in the life of a man who was not always quiet, was rarely strange in the conventional sense, and was sometimes accused of not being entirely human at all. It is worth pausing, at the end of this story, to remember what was at stake. Not just the fate of a few 100,000 German civilians in Bavaria in the autumn of 1945, not just the career of one American general, but the question of what it means, exactly, to win a war. Patton had been thinking about that question for most of his adult life. He had been raised on stories of his Confederate ancestors. He had read every account of every war he could find. He had walked the battlefields of antiquity. He believed, deeply and almost mystically, that he had lived before. That he had fought at Gaugamela with Alexander. That he had ridden with the Romans. That he had marched with Napoleon. He believed that war was eternal, that warriors were a kind of recurring presence in human history, called back to the colours whenever a new struggle began. But he also believed, just as deeply, that the moment of victory was the moment when the warrior had to remember what he was fighting for. The warrior who could not stop killing when the killing was over was not a warrior. He was something else. Something less. When Patton looked at the women at the wire, in the rain, in the mud, in the broken country, he saw the moment of decision. He saw the place where the warrior either becomes the conqueror or becomes something better than the conqueror. He saw the place where America, his America, the America he had crossed an ocean to fight for, either lived up to its own self-image or did not. And he chose, in that moment, with very few words and almost no fanfare, to say that the war was finished. That his men were not going to starve children. That the country he had helped break was a country he was now going to help feed. It was not the final word in the long, complicated argument about how to treat a defeated enemy. That argument continues to this day, in different countries, in different conflicts, in different forms. But it was a word. A real word, spoken by a real man, in a real place, at a real moment in history. And it mattered. It mattered to the soldier who handed over his K-ration. It mattered to the young woman who pressed her child through the wire. It mattered to the child who lived because of that piece of bread, and grew up to be a grandmother who told her grandchildren, decades later, that she had been alive in the worst winter Germany ever knew, and an American general had ordered his men to feed her family. History remembers Patton for his tanks. History remembers him for his speeches. History remembers him for his pearl-handled pistols and his belief in reincarnation and his slap heard around the world. But on a quiet road in Bavaria, in the rain, in the autumn of 1945, history was given another reason to remember him. A quieter reason. A stranger reason. A reason that does not fit neatly into the speeches or the films or the legends. He was the general who, when German women begged American soldiers for food, looked at his men and at the women and at the broken country around him and said, in his own way, that no soldier of his would be punished for behaving like a Christian. That the war was over. That the bread would be shared. That America, in the end, would be the country it had always claimed to be, even if the orders from Washington said otherwise. And in saying that, in choosing mercy at the moment when mercy was most forbidden, he wrote, without intending to, the first true sentence of the long American peace that would follow. A sentence that would not appear in any official report. A sentence that would not be carved on any monument. a sentence that lived only in the memories of the men who heard him speak, and the women who lived because he did.